on corporate IT, leading groups both in the U.S. And in Europe. And so I asked Hans if he would come and present what his observations are from the corporate side to see what we might apply to ourselves on the nonprofit side. So without further ado, Hans, welcome.
Well, thank you, Ed. Thank you for the introduction, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So Ed asked me if I might first give a very short introduction to the Tuck School at Dartmouth and to our Center for Digital Strategies. So the Tuck School is the oldest business school in the world. It was founded in 1900, so it's the oldest MBA program. It's located at Dartmouth College, which you may know is in New England, in the state of New Hampshire. It's by far the smallest of the top business schools. So we have students, about 275 to 280 students in a cohort in a class. And so with two classes at any given time for this resident MBA program, we have about 550 students here. And we'll be ranked anywhere from, in some rankings, #1 all the way to #15. So probably on average, somewheres we're ranked around #6 in the MBA programs in the world. The resident MBA program is our sole degree. So it's the only degree that we offer, no BBAs, no PhDs, etc. As a result, centers or initiatives here at Tuck also have a little bit different flavor than research centers that you might be used to in universities. So our dean, Paul Danos, has asked us to basically do three things. One is to do research in our areas of expertise and publish in that area and be known for that area. Two is to build ties to corporations or other organizations and the people in those organizations who Tuck might otherwise not have ties with. So in this case, for instance, for us, for our center, it's chief information officers. And then three, to bring both those things, i.e. the knowledge and the connections to people and corporations back into the MBA program. And we do that through a variety of things. We run an MBA Fellows program for a small select group of MBAs who particularly want to focus on this intersection of technology and business. We also run classes in the MBA program. We write cases for other classes that we don't teach in the MBA program. We also run a year-long series on a particular theme in technology every year and its impact on business. So that's how we bring things back in to the MBA program and kind of fulfill the third part of our mission, which as a center is really to look at the enabling role of information technology in organizations today, especially in large corporations. So with that introduction, I'll switch over to the slides that I'd like to show you and the presentation today.
We're good, Hans. We see him.
All right. Thank you, Ed. So I find it's always dangerous to talk to a crowd like this because you guys are doing this every day, and I'm just observing it. And I'm mindful that you are from many different places around the world with diverse circumstances and challenges, bigger chapters, smaller chapters. So to be clear, I'm going to focus on what I see as the state of IT in large corporations, primarily in the US and Europe. And I'm going to outline to you what I see as the current and interesting issues in each of a number of trend areas for corporate IT. These trends are not all separate and distinct. They clearly blend into each other. And my goal is simply to give each of you a little food for thought somewhere in this jumble of observations. something that you'll take away and hopefully think about a little bit further. So I guess the first thing that I want to say is, in my view, it's an incredible time to be a CIO. I can't imagine a more exciting time to be a CIO. It's also a challenging time, but such unprecedented connectedness, a rapid pace, not only in communications, but just rapid pace of change that we all have to live with, a resulting incredible volume of data to processed information. And at least in the developed world, everyone is an actor now, and in part, therefore, also considers themselves an expert, which I think is a challenge for all of us. Because information technology is in so many devices now, everything is becoming an actor too. And we have devices embedded in places calling home where the owner doesn't even know that they're doing that. I think it's a much more boundaryless world at this point. Risk is everywhere, but on the other hand, so is opportunity. And the trends that I'd like to talk to you about today are, I'm sure, very familiar to you on the whole, and especially the first couple, consumerization of information technology and the cloud, have been around for quite a while. But maybe the last three or four are increasingly coming out, and I'd say mobile and social stay, in my mind, very relevant and continue to develop at a rapid pace. So consumerization of IT. I guess the first thing that I want to say is this is in many ways a core catalyst for other IT trends that we're going to discuss. In other words, this idea of consumerization rips through a lot of things. And it's not just about devices. And I think we need to remember that often people think bring your own device when you talk about consumerization of corporate IT, but it's also about consumer software, mobile apps. It's also about consumer services, such as Dropbox, for instance. And the security challenges with this have changed quite a bit and frankly proliferated, because what the perimeter is, if there even is such a thing as a perimeter, has changed drastically. And perhaps most of all, I want to reinforce that I think it's become about consumer attitudes and expectations. And it's obvious to all of us as consumers that for customers and external audiences, there's clear expectations that our websites are not just corporate info and that you can interact, et cetera. But perhaps a little bit less obvious is that for employees in big corporations, the expectations of the UI, of the user interface, for every piece of software that they touch has changed dramatically. And the standards are just simply much higher. Even the expectation has come now somehow that IT is responsible for consumer applications, which is kind of a non sequitur. Second big trend is the cloud, and I think this outsourcing of non-value added or standardized infrastructure or just cheaper way of getting those things has changed the nature of who the vendors are and the types of relationships that we have with them. Whoever thought Amazon would be a major vendor of IT storage, for instance? I mean, isn't that where we go shopping as consumers? The terms are also changing. So it's less and less a buy versus make decision, which I'm sure, 10 years ago, all of us were wrestling with that question. And more a buy versus rent lease, or a rent lease versus metered usage, consumption-based pricing, pay-as-you-go decision type of thing. And what you do depends a lot on your business model and what your company is. So a corporation like Bechtel Corporation, big construction company that I'm sure you're all familiar with, that does a lot of big projects, and as a result, their employee base fluctuates a lot, they'll make very different decisions on what and how they buy. Metered usage makes a lot of sense for them. For some other companies, maybe that have a much more stable workforce, that's not the case. I'd say generally larger companies tend to the internal cloud, smaller and medium ones to external. But it's hard to say with all the blends that are available. Really, it's hard to even put an appropriate label on them. I think one thing that is definitely true is that this has led increasingly to shadow IT. Cloud providers love to approach vice presidents elsewhere in the business and sell them software without any knowledge from IT. This, of course, raises huge questions about data, storage, transfer, management, especially in Europe, and particularly around the issue of what in the US we call PII, namely personally identifiable information, and whether it can leave one European country or the country of origin in any form whatsoever, even within the same company's systems. And of course, it's caused the obvious questions about security or new issues around security. In fact, one of my favorite stories about kind of a combination of cloud and consumerization of information technology comes from the CISO, the head of information security of Novartis, the big Swiss pharma. It's not really a security story, but it's an interesting observation on this. And he says, while shadow IT is inevitably an issue to information security, these kinds of IT tools become also an issue in terms of IT support. When Dropbox is too slow or not available, they ring the service desk. Exchange may be something like this. This is business critical. I must have my data. Well, what do you want me to do about it? It's a server somewhere. I don't even know where it is. Might be in California, might be in Azerbaijan. So it's kind of a bit like an employee calling you up and saying, I'm at home and the internet's slow. And not really sure what you're supposed to be doing about that. But it illustrates the type of expectations that our employees have come to have. So another big area, as you know, is mobility, and mobile apps. An obvious tie to consumerization here, to bring your own device. And we are all familiar with the consumer capabilities as customers, but there are some really robust corporate use cases, and increasingly they're being used at important points of real impact. So let me give you a couple of illustrations here. So one would be the field engineering force in Bechtel, the big construction company that I mentioned. So Bechtel faced a huge challenge in their building of the Doha International Airport in Qatar. Their customer, the government of Qatar, as their executives traveled around the world, they'd see something new and they'd immediately wanted it added to their airport to make sure that their airport was the newest and biggest and best. And the result was that things were getting way behind schedule. They had nowhere near enough field quality inspectors there. And the solution, instead of hiring a bunch of new people that they would have had to bring from around the world, turned out to be to enable them all with iPads. It allowed input of data at the point of inspection. It added photograph capability, added access to email and chat, ended up reducing printing and use of fuel, ended up removing safety risks because they weren't on the road as much in dangerous places back and forth. So huge impact and something that really mattered at the cutting edge. Sales is another area. A couple examples that come to mind here are Hilti equipping each salesperson with an Android phone and appropriate apps to essentially have all the information about the customers they were visiting at their fingertips and be able to put them back into the CRM. I think also of Eaton and their very powerful iPad app called PowerSource. It's an app that's used both for sales and for customers. So imagine a pump that goes in a John Deere tractor or a Boeing 737. Has all kinds of configurations. You need a displacement of X and a flow through of Y. Well, in this app, you can search them and find the pump you need from amongst thousands of different types of pumps. The sales guy can tell you, we've made this before. We make it at this plant. The lead time is this. Here's the engineering drawing. He sends you the data on an email, and you can embed the specs in your system, see that it works for you, and essentially together, the customer and the sales guy have taken a cycle time that used to take weeks, literally weeks, and reduced it to a couple of hours. Obviously, this has engendered a big iOS versus Android debate. I'm sure you guys have had that too on the iPhone or on the phone side, and now on tablets too. And regardless of whether it's for BYOD or company devices, I think security is still a major challenge. And yet many companies are thinking mobile first now when they think about development of applications. And in my mind, equally critically is it's not just about mobility, but apps, especially mobile apps as developed, it's also about the ability to do a discrete task quickly and well. And that's the characteristic of a good app. And the fact that it's mobile as well makes it that much better. The big challenge to me for IT here is in the development cycle. Gone is the ability to say, well, yes, we'll put that in the next update to SAP, which comes out in 4 months. The pace is just much quicker, and it's more a question of 4 weeks or 4 days. So Hilti, for instance, Hilti Corporation, tool manufacturer in Liechtenstein, they've developed a separate mobile development group that operates separately from all the rest of the software development. Another best practice we're seeing is going where the talent is. So you need different skills for this. Bechtel decided at first to try to do that at its corporate headquarters in the Washington, D.C. area, failed miserably, realized that they just didn't have the talent, moved that part to San Francisco, are doing wonderfully. Adidas didn't even try in Germany, just went to Barcelona. I think it's changing our relationship with vendors, changing who the vendors are. SAP and others would like to play, but frankly, the real action is elsewhere thus far. It's also changing who new internal partners are. Whoever thought that had to consider branding as they did a piece of software development before? And now clearly the branding, marketing, communications part of the company has a say about that and has to be included in that. There are some very interesting governance models emerging around this. So for instance, a company like Tetra Pak has made the decision that if it's a standalone app, in other words, not connected to back-end systems, and it's for external use for customers, then anybody can do what they want there and develop what they want. And they don't have to go through IT. If it falls in any other category, they do. Social. Well, in some ways, this is just a new channel. In other ways, it's an incredibly fundamental change. So on just the new channel side, picture an airline picking up a complaint on Twitter about the length of a security line and somebody about to miss their plane, goes and sends a representative out to get that person and bring them through, or immediately helps that person rebook. And in some ways, that's just a different channel, because it's a much quicker reaction channel, but it's just a different channel. But the big long-term change is really in engaging in fundamentally fully joined conversations, influencing brand image, influencing products, etc. So as the CIO of Yum Brands likes to say, Yum Brands is a big conglomerate in the US that has brands like Taco Bell and Kentucky Fried Chicken under it. He likes to say social is the largest focus group in the history of the world. And that becomes a lot more powerful then. The velocity, the volume, the viral nature of this and how quickly it moves. So managing the interactions is key, and two stories come to mind here. Nestle marrying Facebook with their CRM to provide a solution. So a customer in the UK is complaining on Facebook about her 2 coffee Nespresso machines breaking. Nestle marries up this social listening with some CRM data. The lady gets a call that day and a loaner machine. She becomes a fan. Nothing but good things to say about Nestle on a medium that's a very broadcast, where, 10 years ago, all she would have been able to tell is her social circle and her 8 neighbors. Another story that I remember is a story that John Iwata, IBM's head of communication, tells. There was a false rumor on a blog about tens of thousands to be laid off at IBM. Because IBM encourages their employees to blog, these IBM employees buried this rumor in a couple of hours far more effectively, honestly, and quickly than he could possibly have done with his communications team. There are challenges here, certainly. You have to be genuine. You have to interact in a manner consistent with your brand, but there are real opportunities there. An emerging best practice for some companies is a social operations center. So 2 companies that I know that do this are Taco Bell and Dell. Taco Bell has a daily meeting. Every morning they start off their day with a meeting in their social operations center, looking at the social traffic on all kinds of different means, Twitter, Facebook, whatever it may be, with marketing, communications, IT, and research and insight all at the table, looking at what's going on and deciding how to react. Brian Hovey, Executive Director of Global Marketing Operations at Dell, says about their operations that social media has really helped them get a better handle on what their customers are really thinking. They take the static information like transaction history and firmographic information and overlay social data on top of that to augment the targeting and opportunity identification in their modeling. And what they're seeing back is a business benefit that is much higher in results in terms of the likelihood of close than they possibly could have anticipated. So here's an area that I think is increasingly coming, this and the next one on the Internet of Things. And IT being embedded in products and enabling services is really enabling new business models, especially in the service area. So I think of Eaton Corporation, putting a sensor in a pressurized piece of hose. It gives an indicator of an impending failure, allowing predictive and preventive maintenance on large-scale equipment, so high dollar value item that if it went down would be sitting idle and costing lots of money, and improve the safety conditions for their employees and the people working around that equipment greatly. Hilti Corporation, they do fleet management of tools for customers. They've embedded chips in all their tools and enables them to do a lot better fleet management. It also has enabled them to offer services. One of the big challenges for construction companies is certain regulations that only allow so many hours a day of certain activities, especially using machinery that causes lots and lots of vibrations. So they now have a safety app that tracks the vibrations and notifies employees and their bosses when the employees are reaching their limits. Nike, something we're probably all familiar with, the concept of the fuel band, a real combination of a physical product with digital services, human and coaching services, gamification, even social, so comparisons with others and ability to share with your friends. So this is really requiring new operating models inside the company, especially I think for IT and product development in this case. IT and research and development, R&D. My observations would be that the technology capabilities are far outstripping both the business model and the operating model imaginations that people and companies are able to have right now. So an extreme example here, and I recognize this is an extreme example, but still, I think it's an interesting one, is with Caterpillar. Caterpillar is a leading, the Caterpillar sales are a leading indicator of an economic upswing or downturn. Current equipment usage, so not new equipment, current equipment usage is a leading indicator of new equipment sales for Caterpillar. So therefore, obviously, current equipment usage becomes a leading indicator of the economy. And as Frank Bonsamino once said, he's the CIO of Time Warner Cable, once said at a round table, he looked at the CIO of Caterpillar and said, so why is it that you're using this data for management? Wouldn't it be a lot higher value add for Caterpillar if you were selling that data to Wall Street? That's, of course, really out of the box, and it's not at all what Caterpillar does. But it kind of gives you a feel for the types of places that these things could go. It raises lots and lots of questions about data usage and about ownership. So to use the Hilti example again, many customers aren't all that happy about the fleet management that Hilti could offer, especially when it's fleet management of tools that are other than from their brand, because they see too much power in the value chain transferring to Hilti. So this is the one place where I'm going to actually give you a definition of the Internet of Things, the one trend I'm going to define. And the reason is because every time I read about this, I read volumes and the first page is taken up on an introduction of what the Internet of Things actually is. And a colleague of mine who is the head of a company called INEX Advisors, Chris Resendez, has come up with a very simple phrase that resonates with me, and I hope it resonates with you, and it's a simple 5 words. He calls it the instrumentation of the physical world. And I'd argue that based on 2 roundtables we had, one of which Ed participated in 2 weeks ago, this is much more real than we yet believe, at least than I believed. And based on what people in the rest of the room said, I think it is for them too. I'd also observed that B2B and B2C are surprised by how much they have to learn from each other. So a couple brief use cases. In the logistics arena, Holcim, big global cement company, very quiet Swiss company, but second largest cement company in the world, uses instrumentation of trucks to optimize the routing of trucks, especially in India, the monitoring of the route deviations to prevent hitchhiking, for instance, which is a big problem, controlling flow in plants. There are 12,000 trucks, Holcim trucks, that roll per day in India, and this allows them to control the flow in plants, and interestingly also allows their customers to see where their trucks are and when their truck is going to get to its location to make that delivery. Safety is another area. So again, Holcim equips its trucks with speed alerts. Bechtel equips its trucks in the Andes with retina scanners and has the ability to notify drivers and even force a truck shutdown if the retina scan indicates that there's not enough oxygen in the air, that the driver is not getting enough oxygen into their system. Remote monitoring, Chevron is an example here. In the middle of the US, the monitoring of pump jacks and the data that they get from that about pump failures, they're using to see when the pressure is building and in a particular pump and proactively replace the casing or the rod or whatever the problem is. So these are use cases kind of on a logistics operations area. I would say on the customer side, so far the data seems to be that they're enhancing customer experience is a higher use case at this point than creating new revenue. I think that will change over time, but that's the experience so far. I think another observation in this arena would be that the current big IT vendors are not likely to be the chief players going forward in technology, or perhaps if they are, it'll only be the ones on the hardware side. Overall, I think personally that the Internet of Things will, along with social, disrupt value chains much more than the other big trends. And I think if you think the commonality there is in the amount of data that they create, both social and IoT. In talking with executives and at these two roundtables, we did a little poll as to what the weakest point was. What's going to cause this not to move forward as quickly as it could? Is it technology? Is it governments and regulation? Is it simply, human nature, societal resistance? Or is it corporations? And unanimously, some picked two things as tied, but every single one, 34 for 34, picked corporations as a roadblock, either one of one or one of two roadblocks. And when asked where we thought we were on that, with one being not very far along and five being doing really well, it was the results were somewheres around a 2.5 in terms of the rating that was given. And the main reason is analytics and dealing with the data. And there's also, I think, very interesting questions here around actuation, by which I mean, at what point does a sensor make the decision? Do you remotely authorize that or automatically authorize a sensor to make a decision to shut something down and not even involve a person in that? And there are lots of course, legal questions and others around that, but I think there's some really interesting questions around that coming. A couple thoughts on big data and analytics. I'd say an emerging thought is that broad or wide matters as much as deep. People tend to be really good at going deep, or better at going deep than they are broad and wide at any rate, and likely has more potential. The future is much more about marrying of structured with unstructured data, external data from outside of your company with internal data, etc., all with the goal of being predictive. Big data is definitely hard, but you can have some even small wins just by pulling together a couple of disparate sources of data in a particular app for a particular opportunity to make a particular type of decision. The best results so far seem to be in industrial operations areas and in social media. There's a clear understanding, I think, that you have to know some questions you want to answer. You can't just fumble around in the data, but you also have to be ready for other questions to emerge from the data itself. And that skill set issues there are skill set issues in big companies. People lack data scientists. And so as Keith Sturgill, there's interesting combinations of talents happening here. And as Keith Sturgill, the CIO of Eastman Chemical, said, so they're in the process of bringing together three unique skill sets within Eastman. One is the traditional IT business analytics. The second is a group of statisticians that they've had long there. And the third is their operations research group. And the hope is that they can together become the inside enablers that bring together a unique set of skill sets and make more of that data than Eastman possibly could otherwise. One idea that I'd like to leave with you around data and IoT also comes from Chris Resendez from INEX Advisors, and I'm not going to go any deeper into this, but it's just the idea that maybe we should be thinking about all of this instead of like a value chain and how much value can you steal from your neighbor up on either side of you in the value chain, maybe this is much more like a honeycomb of interest with an asset of some type at the center. That asset could be material or it could be data or whatever, and a need to construct a way to find for everyone to get their appropriate value out of that honeycomb. And my guess is that you, as international NGOs, probably really would be quicker to get this idea than many of the CIOs of large corporations would be. So last trend is security, and I just want to point out a couple things here. The question is not if you're going to get attacked, but when. The mode is gone. Prevention is not enough. The CIO of Bechtel would say that the appropriate approach to this is detect, deter, respond, and remediate. And this came out of a very hard lesson. 2 years ago, they had an APT, an Advanced Persistent Threat. It took the FBI helping to alert them to what was going on. They did 9 months of preparation for a 3-day shutdown where every single device across the globe of Bechtel's was taken off of the internet. Imagine that. And the result is now, in order to allow them to remediate over those 3 days, the result is now a much more operation-centered approach where they're constantly looking for anomalies. And he actually feels like they have a lot to learn about how to handle big data from how they've learned how to handle the security data and flow. And I would say overall in the security arena, data categorization is still a big issue. And one thing that I think is very interesting from the military that businesses don't think about at all is, when is it time to de-escalate data, something? And when is it time sometimes to read someone off? So in the military, you have this practice when you get a new job, you get read on for what you need to know for that job, whatever level of security you need. When you leave that job, you get what's called read off for that job. And I think in most corporations, I don't know how it is in nonprofits, but in most corporations, all you do is keep accumulating access over time and access to more things. When you leave a job, you don't lose anything. So overall, consequences for IT, I think it's clear that the technology is more developed than our organizations or the organizations around us are. Data has to move, it has to be shared, and yet it must be protected. The pace of everything is very different than it was 10 years ago. There are different internal arguments. You know, in many companies, especially industrial companies, the idea of operational technology versus information technology has long been a tension. I would add to that now, certainly marketing technology is a tension with information technology. You have very different external impact and visibility and interactions than you used to, much closer to the customer. And therefore, different skill sets are needed within IT, including a much closer tie to the rest of the business. And I'd leave you with these parting thoughts. My good friend Martin Petri is the the CIO of Hilti Corporation, always talks about a solid core and a flexible boundary. You have to have the solid core, but you have to have a flexible boundary where devices can be used to access in an appropriate way that solid core, APIs, etc. And it's each of those is important. You can't have one be good without the other. One of my favorite quotes from a good friend who's the chief scientist for Salesforce.com, JP Rangaswamy. He's also a noted blogger, by the way, if you're ever interested. He has a great blog that's called Confused of Calcutta. He says, IT has to design for loss of control. I'd also urge you to think about, how do you help the business think about data use and value? What are your golden nuggets? Do people even know what they are? how can you enable but protect? And what I like to say is, where do you draw the line between being Dr. No and Mr. Goodfellow? And you can only be Dr. No for so long. I think there's a real chance for IT to impact recruiting and retention. Chief Information Officer of VW, Martin Hoffman, has stood up and said their primary reason for going BYOD is not any of the reasons we talked about so far. It is to enable VW to attract the right type of talent, not just into IT, but across the corporation. And last but not least, and Ed and I think, agree largely, but maybe slightly on how to phrase this, but disagree maybe slightly on how to phrase this, and that is that the idea of the business, as if the rest of the business was somehow separate from IT, as a customer for IT, is, in my view, overdone. This is a partnership. It has to be a partnership. The knowledge must be combined to enhance the business model. But I also completely acknowledge that it's important to keep a strong service approach, and certainly to be very careful about slipping into a compliance mentality. So those are my thoughts for you, and at this point, I'd be very happy to answer any questions that you might have. Ed, I hope I didn't run over too long.
Thanks, Hans. I think we have time for one or two questions. So this may be pushing us back to when we were in school and hearing an important lecture. But if you take a pause and maybe think about how some of these things apply to us in the nonprofit space, we certainly are hearing from our senior managers as well as our colleagues around organizations about what do you think about big data, what do you think about the Internet of Things. I think Hans covered rather some provocative aspects of those. But some of these issues that you heard him describe that corporations are going through, have been going through recently, are probably going to be ones that come to our door within the next few years. I tend to think that some corporate issues are leading indicators for us. And so the good news is we can allow the corporations to make the mistakes, and then we can hopefully benefit from that learning. But questions for Hans? Anybody have a question? Yes, we have a question here.
Hi, Hans. Bill Brothers from the American Red Cross, and I thought it was interesting your comment in the beginning that the corporations are what everyone in the round table believed would be the impediment, and I just want to make sure I understood that statement. My assumption was it had to do with corporations' inherent controlling nature and structure and a lack of nimbleness, if you will. And I just want to make sure, is that the reason? Because on one hand, I see the corporations with all the resources and all the money to be able to drive innovation and pay for innovation. So I guess I was just trying to understand that statement a little bit more. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, I think, Bill, that you're right. That is what it is. It's that they felt that their own ability to take all the possibilities that they see and translate them into business models that work and into ways of creating value that someone is willing to pay for, or sets them up for something else that someone is willing to pay for, as well as their ability to change their own mindset and move quickly enough on it. In other words, they did not feel like, oh, well, yeah, we'd love to do X, but the technology isn't there. Nor did they feel, despite the privacy issues and other things that certainly exist out there in society, they also did not feel that, well, we really love to do X, Y, and Z, but the culture of the society around us, the culture of our customers, the consumers, won't permit it, we can't do that. And they also did not feel that, well, we're being regulated by government and we have these constraints and this constraints and so on and so forth. All those things, I think they agree exist in some way, shape, or form. But in the end, the consistency was astonishing. I mean, I'd say probably 30 out of those 34 said solely corporations. And I think the other 4, of which I was one, said corporations and society or kind of people's attitudes. Well, maybe 3 were, and I think 1, if I remember right, said corporations and government regulation. But nobody didn't say corporations. And it was stunning to me, and it was stunning to both rooms, the one in Irvine, California in February, and the one Ed was in Zurich 2 weeks ago.
One last question. Laurent, please introduce yourself.
Yes. Laurent Monet from the French Red Cross. Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. I have just one question about one movement that I see as an important one in the moment. I would like to speak about open data. I want to have your view about open data, especially for us as an NGO. And do you think that this movement is going to continue, or what do you think about this movement and how we can use it to develop our activities?
Okay, Laurent, can you maybe elaborate just a little bit about what open data, in what context you're thinking of this?
We see in France, but I think it's the same in the United States and in Europe. We have seen that a lot of governments and encourage actors, public actors, to liberate their data, so that to generate values, trying to develop new application, crossing data from different kind of service, public services, and so on. So, did you see that? Do you see that in the United States, and how it will develop?
I get that. Okay, thank you. Now I understand. First of all, I do think that it is something that will continue to develop. We don't see it anywhere as near as hugely yet in the U.S. as we perhaps might like to, but I think especially from public entities, that they will be forced in that direction. I think just the kind of democratization of data will, and the desire for corporations and others to be able to use that will force that in that direction. I also think that corporations and many other types of entities really want that, because that's part of the ability to combine structured data that they may have already with unstructured data from other sources. And then if you can combine that kind of with social listening, et cetera, type of unstructured data, you suddenly have a very powerful set of things. So you take something that has kind of maybe for quite a while already been in the open sector, let's say data around weather, okay, which could just be, that's maybe an early indicator of other types of things that governments could be opening up and giving more on, and so on and so forth too. If you think about that, where that was 20 years ago and where that is today, that's a very different thing. And a company like Bechtel would say, if I know the weather of a particular area and I have a data for how much heavy equipment is in that area, and I have data about my own employees or contractors and how experienced they are, I can mash that up into something that can immediately tell me that, oh boy, weather's bad tomorrow, lots of heavy equipment there, lots of inexperienced people, maybe plus we're operating near an area where there are lots of civilians, tomorrow could be a major safety challenge. And that's just a very small example, but I think it's the type of thing that you're leaning towards. And yes, I do think that that's something that's going to keep coming. And I think it's something that companies, big companies, are increasingly looking to, and a source of data that they're increasingly seeing as important. And by the way, an area where I think that will also have real impact, and where at the moment is a real problem to share around, is on information security, on cyber threats and so on. And there is a huge necessity there. That's the biggest screaming necessity that I see. And of course, that's very hard. How do you do that? That's a huge challenge. But thank you for your question.
So thanks, Hans. We need to wrap up and move on to the next session. I would point out to those that are interested in following up on this question of open data, take a look at data.unhcr.org and see what UNHCR is doing in terms of open data that they're now providing on refugees. They're a leader in this space. And the second is the Open Humanitarian Initiative that NetHope and I believe Rockefeller Foundation are co-sponsoring. So take a look at that initiative also. So I think it's Hans is right in terms of the opportunities for corporations to mash up types of data that are readily available in the public. But I think what we know from our experience in the humanitarian space is a lot easier for humanitarian organizations to be open about data and share data. Some of that's going to be required by our governments and our societies, and others of which we just have an advantage for sharing that information. So take a look at those open data initiatives and what they hold in terms of promise for the future. Hans, thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day in Hanover. Hopefully spring has started there. We're enjoying a fabulous day here, but really appreciate you coming to this through video. We're delighted the technology worked, and thank you for all of your patience in making this happen. I hope to see you and talk to you soon. Good day.
Okay, I'm just going to pop